It was a quiet evening at the family-owned restaurant, the kind of place where locals came to unwind after a long day. The scent of fresh-cooked meals wafted through the air, and soft chatter filled the room, creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere. But behind the scenes, things were about to take a dramatic turn. A new waiter had recently started working there, eager to prove himself, but his attitude wasn't as warm as the meals being served. He had a reputation for making offhand comments, and tonight, those comments would cross a dangerous line. As the restaurant buzzed with activity, a couple walked in, a regular customer and his wife. The wife, who was of a different background, had always been treated kindly by the staff. But this time, the new waiter took a different approach. Without thinking, he made a careless and insulting remark as he handed the couple their menus. He didn't see the warning signs in their eyes, the quiet tension between the husband and wife, nor the fact that the husband was quietly observing him from a distance. The wife, hurt but composed, ignored the comment, trying to make the best of the evening. But the waiter didn't stop there. He continued making disparaging remarks about her heritage. The restaurant was busy, but a few patrons overheard, and whispers began to circulate. Unbeknownst to the waiter, the husband was the owner of the restaurant. He'd watched the entire interaction, his face unreadable. His wife, ever the calm one, hadn't yet said a word to him about what had happened. But when the meal ended, the couple stood to leave, and the husband did something unexpected. He called the waiter over, and with a small, knowing smile, he told him to meet him in the back office after the shift. The waiter, unaware of the gravity of the situation, simply nodded and went on with his duties, thinking it was just another routine request. But as the hours passed, the tension in the air grew thick. Everyone knew something was brewing, but no one could predict what would happen next. Would the waiter face the consequences of his disrespect, or would his arrogance keep him blind to the storm coming his way? As the evening went on, the buzz of the restaurant continued, but the air felt different. The usual chatter, clinking of silverware, and laughter had a sharp edge to it, like a storm cloud on the horizon. The waiter, oblivious to the unfolding drama, went about his work with an air of confidence that had bordered on arrogance. He was young, eager to make a name for himself in the city's competitive restaurant scene. But he also had a chip on his shoulder, a quiet belief that he was destined for something bigger than the small restaurant he found himself in. It was this mindset that made him dismissive of people who didn't fit into his idea of success or worth. He had worked at other places before, but nothing like this. This family-owned restaurant, tucked away on a quiet corner, was different. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't trendy, but it had something special, a loyalty among its patrons that couldn't be bought. The owner had built it from the ground up, with hard work and a deep love for food. People didn't come here just for a meal. They came for the experience. They came for the warmth, the sense of belonging, the history of the place. And no one knew this better than the owner himself. The waiter had only been there a few weeks, but in that short time, he had already noticed the subtle power dynamics at play. The owner, always calm, always steady, rarely showed any emotion. His wife, too, was always composed, but there was something about her that made people take notice. She carried herself with grace and kindness, but there was a quiet strength about her. The waiter hadn't given much thought to these things until tonight. Tonight, he had made the mistake of assuming he could say whatever he wanted, without consequence. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was the history that lay beneath the surface. The husband and wife weren't just the owners of the restaurant. They were a team, partners in life and in business. They had built this place together through years of struggle, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication. Their bond was unbreakable, forged in the fires of adversity. They had faced challenges that most people could never imagine, but they had always risen above them, together. The wife, in particular, had experienced her own set of struggles long before she had met her husband. Born in another country, she had faced prejudice and discrimination from a young age. But she never let it break her. Instead, she became stronger, more determined to prove herself to the world. It was this resilience that had drawn the owner to her in the first place. He had seen something in her that no one else had, something that made her the perfect partner for him, both in business and in life. The waiter, on the other hand, hadn't lived through any of that. He had grown up in a privileged neighborhood where opportunities came easily, and the world seemed to bend to his will. He had never had to fight for anything, never had to endure hardship, and it showed in the way he treated people. To him, the world was a place where people were either winners or losers, and he was firmly convinced that he was one of the former. He didn't care about the struggles of others, especially when it came to people who didn't share his background or his view of success. As the night wore on, the tension between the waiter and the couple seemed to grow. The wife, though silent, had taken note of the waiter's remarks, and it had stung. She had been through too much to let these things slide, but she also knew that picking a fight with someone who clearly didn't understand the weight of his words would be a waste of energy. Instead, she quietly made her way to the back, where her husband was speaking with the kitchen staff. The owner was no stranger to conflict. Over the years, he had dealt with difficult customers, disgruntled employees, and 1,000 other challenges, but he had always handled things with calm and fairness. He didn't tolerate disrespect, but he also believed in second chances. Tonight, though, something felt different. His wife had always been his rock, his partner in everything. Seeing her hurt, even in small ways, stirred something deep within him, a fierce protectiveness that he hadn't even realized was there. He had noticed the waiter's behavior earlier in the evening. He had heard the subtle insults, seen the way the waiter had looked at his wife, like she was someone beneath him. It wasn't the first time the waiter had acted this way, but it was the first time it had been so obvious. The owner had never liked to play the role of the heavy, preferring instead to lead with kindness and understanding. But tonight, that approach felt inadequate. Tonight, the waiter had crossed a line, and the owner knew it. As the last of the customers filed out of the restaurant and the staff began cleaning up, the owner motioned for the waiter to come to the back office. The air felt thick as the young man approached, still unaware of the storm brewing around him. He was humming under his breath, his mind already turning to the plans he had made for her after his shift. He wasn't expecting a confrontation. He wasn't even sure why he had been called back there. The owner was sitting at his desk, his back to the door. When the waiter entered, he didn't turn around at first. Instead, he took a long breath, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the desk. The quiet in the room was almost suffocating. The waiter shifted nervously. "You wanted to see me." The owner didn't respond immediately. He just kept tapping his fingers, his mind working through his thoughts. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Sit down." The waiter hesitated, then took a seat in front of the desk, still unsure of what was happening. He waited for the owner to speak, his eyes darting around the room. It was then that he noticed the small photograph on the desk, a picture of the owner and his wife, taken years ago, with smiles that seemed to capture the essence of their partnership. The waiter had never really paid attention to the details before, but something about the photo seemed significant. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this meeting, was going to change everything. The owner finally turned in his chair, his gaze locking onto the waiter's. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was something else, something that made the waiter's stomach twist. "Let me ask you something," the owner began, his voice still calm but with a sharp edge. "What do you think makes someone worthy of respect?" The waiter blinked, caught off guard by the question. It wasn't what he had expected, and it certainly wasn't the way he thought things would go. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words got stuck in his throat. What was the right answer? What did the owner want to hear? He stammered, but the owner cut him off. "I'm asking because I'm not sure you understand what respect is," he said. "I've been watching you, and I've seen the way you treat people, especially my wife." The waiter's face flushed. He opened his mouth to deny it, but the words died on his lips. He didn't know how to defend himself. His mind raced, and his heart began to pound. The room suddenly felt much smaller, the weight of the owner's words pressing in on him. "I don't think you realize who she is," the owner continued, his voice now tinged with a quiet intensity. "Or who I am, for that matter." The waiter sat frozen, unable to speak. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning, but the tension between them was far from over. The mystery deepened, and the waiter knew he was only beginning to understand the full scope of what he had gotten himself into. The weight of the owner's words hung in the air like a storm cloud that had yet to burst. The waiter sat there, unable to move, his pulse quickening as the silence stretched on. He could feel the heat rising to his face, a mix of embarrassment and confusion clouding his mind. What was the owner trying to say? What did he mean by not understanding who his wife was? Was it some kind of test? The owner's gaze never wavered, his eyes sharp and unblinking. The room felt smaller with each passing second, and the waiter could hear his own breath growing louder in the quiet. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. This wasn't what he had expected. He had assumed that the owner would just reprimand him and send him home with a warning, maybe even a lecture on customer service. But this was different. The owner leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his fingers steepled together. There was a quiet intensity in the way he looked at the waiter, as if he was weighing something in his mind. For a moment, the waiter felt like he was being examined, judged in a way that went far beyond his behavior tonight. The tension in the room grew heavier, each second adding to the pressure. "Do you know what it's like to lose everything?" the owner asked suddenly, his voice low but deliberate. The waiter blinked, caught off guard by the question. He shook his head, still unsure of where this conversation was headed. "No, I don't suppose you do," the owner continued, his voice softening just slightly. "You've never had to struggle, never had to fight for a place in this world. You don't know what it's like to have everything taken from you just because of where you come from or how you look." The waiter felt his stomach tighten, a wave of discomfort washing over him. He opened his mouth again, this time trying to find some way to explain himself, but the owner wasn't done. "My wife," the owner said, his voice suddenly colder, "knows exactly what that's like. She's fought battles you can't even imagine. And you think it's okay to belittle her, to make her feel small." The waiter's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. He had assumed the wife was just the owner's partner in business, but he hadn't considered the depth of her story. The way the owner spoke about her, his words heavy with emotion, made it clear that there was more to her than met the eye. He had insulted not just the wife of a businessman, but the woman who had overcome so much, who had carried the weight of battles he had never known. A cold sweat began to form on the waiter's brow. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His casual comments hadn't been just insults. They were personal, deep cuts into a life and a history he didn't understand. His face flushed with guilt, but he still couldn't find the right words to take back what he had done. The owner stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, making the waiter jump. He paced behind the desk, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The tension in the room crackled with energy, a storm just waiting to explode. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" the owner said, his voice rising just enough to send a shiver down the waiter's spine. "You think the world owes you something just because you walk in here with that arrogance. But you've forgotten one thing. Respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn." The waiter's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to apologize, wanted to make things right, but the words wouldn't come. He felt like he was drowning in the weight of his own ignorance. "I've seen it all," the owner continued, his voice now even, but with a dangerous undertone. "I've seen people like you, people who think they can get by on charm and privilege. But when it all comes crashing down, when the reality of life hits, you'll find that there's no one left to help you. And you'll remember this moment. You'll remember how you treated someone who didn't deserve it." The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the back of the kitchen, the distant clink of dishes being washed. The waiter's throat tightened, his hands beginning to shake. His thoughts swirled in confusion. Had he really been so blind to his own behavior? So careless? The owner stopped pacing and turned toward him. There was something in his eyes now, something that made the waiter's stomach twist with anxiety. "You have no idea who I really am, do you?" The waiter opened his mouth, ready to speak, but again, the words got stuck. The owner's expression darkened, and the weight of his gaze seemed to pin him to the chair. "Maybe," the owner said slowly, his voice low and dangerous. "It's time you learned." The waiter felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the air, an unmistakable shift in the power dynamics. It was as if the owner, until now a figure of calm and control, had become something else entirely, something unforgiving. The atmosphere in the room had changed. What had been a quiet confrontation was now a showdown. The waiter realized, with a jolt, that he had crossed a line he couldn't undo. The mistake had been made, and there was no turning back. For the first time that evening, the waiter felt truly afraid. The owner's calm demeanor had given way to something colder, something far more intense. He had never seen this side of him before, the side that wasn't just a businessman, but someone who had lived through more than he could ever imagine. "You'll understand soon enough," the owner murmured, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But I don't think you'll like what you learn." The waiter's breath caught in his throat as the owner turned and walked toward the back door. He paused, just for a moment, then glanced over his shoulder. "When you're ready to stop pretending, you'll find me." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the waiter in the silence of the office. The weight of the conversation lingered, the questions multiplying in his mind. What did the owner mean? What was coming next? How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? As he sat there, alone in the dark room, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The night was far from over, and the storm was far from finished. The waiter knew that his actions had set something in motion, but what that something was, he couldn't even begin to guess. The tension was unbearable, each moment stretching out like an eternity. The worst part, he knew the answers were out of his reach. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed in the empty office, leaving the waiter to sit alone in the oppressive silence. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that had just transpired. He could still hear the owner's voice in his head, the coldness lacing each word. "When you're ready to stop pretending, you'll find me." What had that meant? What had he gotten himself into? The waiter sat there, paralyzed, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had never felt so out of control. The usual confidence that had come with his youth, with his belief that he could charm his way through anything, had evaporated in a matter of minutes. Now, all he could do was sit there, wrestling with his own growing fear. He wasn't sure how long he had been sitting there when the door to the office creaked open again. Startled, he quickly stood up, his heart racing as he turned to face whoever had entered. He half expected the owner to return, but it wasn't him. Standing in the doorway was the wife. The waiter's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't supposed to be here, not after everything that had happened. She had left quietly earlier in the evening, her presence having barely been noticed as she slipped away to the back. But now, here she was, standing in front of him, her expression unreadable. There was no anger in her eyes, no accusation. But there was something about her, something that sent a chill through him. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. She didn't say a word, but her eyes, those calm, quiet eyes, seemed to pierce through him. The waiter opened his mouth to speak, to explain himself, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't find the words to undo what had already been said. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You think you've done something bad, don't you?" The question took him off guard. He nodded quickly, the shame washing over him again. "I didn't mean." She held up her hand, stopping him. "It's not about what you meant. It's about what you did." The waiter's heart began to race again. He felt as if the room were closing in on him, and the weight of her gaze made it hard to breathe. He thought back to the words he had spoken earlier, the way he had insulted her, the casual cruelty that had flowed so easily from his lips. He had never seen it as a big deal, never considered the implications of his actions. But now, in the quiet of the office, with her standing there, it felt like he was being exposed for everything he truly was. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words barely a whisper. "I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were, what you've been through." Her gaze softened just a fraction, but her voice remained steady. "It's not about knowing. It's about understanding." The waiter swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. He had thought he understood people, thought he had a grip on how the world worked. But this moment, this conversation, was peeling back layers of his arrogance, exposing his ignorance. He felt small, exposed. She stepped into the room, slowly, deliberately. "You're not the first person to make those kinds of mistakes, and you won't be the last. But this isn't something that's just going to go away with an apology." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the waiter was struck by the depth of them. It wasn't just about him being rude. It wasn't just about a simple misstep or a careless comment. This was bigger. He could feel it now, that there was more to this story, something he hadn't even begun to understand. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her back to him, walking toward the small window that overlooked the street. The soft light from the street lamps cast a long shadow across her face, making her look almost ethereal in the dim glow. She stared out the window for a long time, as if lost in her thoughts. The waiter felt his stomach twist. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer in control of the situation. The calm facade that had seemed so powerful before was crumbling, piece by piece. Finally, she turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. "The owner has been patient with you, more patient than most people would be. But this is your last chance. If you don't understand the weight of what you've done, there will be consequences." The waiter froze. Consequences? What did she mean? "I don't want you to think this is some small thing," she continued, her voice low and serious. "What you said to me wasn't just an insult. It was an attack. It wasn't just me you hurt. You've disrespected everything we've worked for, everything we've fought for." Her words landed like blows, and the waiter felt the full weight of them, crushing his chest. He had underestimated her, underestimated what she represented. He thought she was just the wife, just the woman behind the scenes. But now he was beginning to realize that she was far more than that. She was a force to be reckoned with, just as much as her husband, if not more. "You can't walk away from this," she added, her voice steady but with a note of warning. "You've crossed a line, and there's no going back. Not unless you make things right." He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize once again, but this time, the words didn't come. There was something in her presence that silenced him. This wasn't about fixing things with a few empty words. This wasn't something that could be smoothed over with a simple apology. He could see that now. "I don't expect you to understand everything right now," she said, taking a step closer. "But I do expect you to make a choice. You need to decide who you're going to be. You need to decide what kind of man you want to be." Her words stung, and he felt them deep in his bones. Who did he want to be? He had spent so long assuming he knew exactly who he was. But now he wasn't so sure. For a moment, they stood in silence. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. She paused just before leaving, glancing over her shoulder. "Think carefully, because this is your moment," she said, her tone almost cryptic. "You may never get another chance." With that, she left, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The waiter sat there, his mind spinning. He had thought he was just some new guy making a mistake, but now he was beginning to realize the gravity of it all. The stakes had just been raised, and he had no idea how high they really were. The silence in the room was deafening, and the waiter's heart pounded in his chest. He had never been more certain of one thing. The choices he made in the coming moments would determine everything, and he had no idea what would happen next. The air felt thick with anticipation as the waiter sat there, the seconds stretching into eternity. He had thought he understood the gravity of the situation, but now, sitting in the silence of the office, everything felt different. It was as if the walls were closing in on him, the weight of his past mistakes pressing down harder than before. He thought about the owner's words, the wife's warnings, and felt a cold sweat form on his brow. He had no more excuses left, no way to deny the gravity of what he had done. Time passed in a blur, and he knew he couldn't avoid the inevitable any longer. He had to make a choice. He had to step up and confront the consequences of his actions, no matter how painful it might be. But where was the owner? Where was the man who had set this entire chain of events into motion? He had to face him, make things right, or at least try to. The waiter stood up from his seat, a surge of determination flowing through him. It was time to take responsibility. He had hurt someone, insulted them, and treated them as if they were nothing more than a shadow of the real person in the room. He couldn't keep pretending he didn't know the consequences of his words anymore. The realization was sharp, stinging in its clarity. He had no choice but to act. Just as he stepped toward the door, it swung open again. This time, it wasn't the wife, but the owner. His presence filled the room like an unspoken storm, his gaze as unflinching as it had been earlier. The waiter's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he froze. The owner walked in slowly, his footsteps measured, deliberate. "You made your decision then?" he asked, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge to it. The waiter nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand now. Everything. I'm ready to make it right." The words felt heavy on his tongue, but they were honest. There was no turning back now. The owner studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It wasn't a smile of kindness, but one that held an almost dangerous amusement. "Good, because I've been waiting for you to come to this point." The waiter felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the air, a tension so thick it almost felt suffocating. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The owner leaned in, his smile fading into something far more serious. "You don't know who I really am, do you?" His voice dropped lower. "You didn't just insult my wife tonight. You insulted the very thing I've built, our legacy." The waiter felt a knot form in his stomach. He had already learned that there was far more to the story than he had ever imagined. But this revelation sent a shockwave through him. "Your legacy," he repeated, his voice trembling. "What do you mean?" The owner straightened, stepping back and motioning toward the door. "Follow me." The waiter's heart raced, confusion swirling in his mind. But he followed the owner, his feet moving almost automatically. They walked out of the office, through the back halls of the restaurant, and into a hidden, private room the waiter had never seen before. It was small, dimly lit, and decorated with photographs and plaques. But it was the items on the shelves that took his breath away. He saw old newspaper clippings, framed and yellowing with age, articles about powerful figures in the city, about battles fought and lost. But as his eyes scanned the room, one thing caught his attention: a large photograph, framed in gold. It was the owner and his wife, but they weren't standing in front of the restaurant. They were standing in front of a larger-than-life building, a building with an unmistakable logo, a logo that the waiter recognized instantly. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. This is the corporation," he whispered, his voice barely audible. You were the head of that, the one who built it." The owner nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "That's right. This restaurant, this life we built, is nothing but a small part of something much bigger. My wife and I have worked our entire lives to create something that changes lives. And you thought you could tear it down with a few careless words." The waiter was speechless, his world tilting. He had always known the owner had influence, But this was a whole different level. He had insulted not just a businessman, but someone who had changed the course of an industry, someone whose success was unparalleled. I didn't know, the waiter said, the truth dawning on him with brutal clarity. I didn't know what you and your wife had done. I didn't understand. The owner's gaze softened just slightly, but the intensity remained. That's the problem, isn't it? You never bothered to understand. He gestured toward the photograph. All of this, it's not just about wealth or power. It's about respect. It's about recognizing that not everyone you meet is just a figure in the background. Sometimes, the people you look down on are the ones who fought the hardest to get where they are. The waiter's chest tightened with regret. I was wrong, he admitted. I was foolish. I thought. You thought you knew everything. The owner interrupted, his voice a little softer now. But you didn't. And that's the lesson. Life doesn't just hand you respect. It's something you have to earn. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. But here's the real twist, kid. The waiter looked up, uncertainty flooding him once again. Everything you've been through tonight, the owner continued, his voice now a little more grim, is a test of your character. And that's the part you didn't see coming. The waiter's mind raced. A test. The owner nodded. I'm not here to ruin your life, but I am here to teach you a lesson. If you walk away from this understanding what you've done wrong and truly making amends, you'll have a place here. You'll be given a chance to rebuild, starting with real respect, real work. He let the words sink in, the tension in the room palpable. But if you don't, if you think you can take the easy way out and pretend this never happened, then you're finished. The waiter stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He understood now, more than ever before. This wasn't just about words. This was about everything. His choice in this moment would define the rest of his life. And just as he thought he had grasped it all, the owner added one final twist that would change everything. By the way, the owner said with a dangerous smile, the reason I had you tested wasn't just to see if you'd learn. It was because my wife, she's not just anyone. She's been watching you for a long time. And now so have I. The room seemed to spin as the waiter realized the depth of the game he had just been thrust into. The stakes were higher than he could have imagined, and the last question loomed large in his mind. Would he be able to rise from the ashes of his own arrogance, or would he fall into irrelevance, swallowed by the very world he had once dismissed so easily? The words echoed in the waiter's mind, sending a chill through his veins. The owner and his wife, two figures he had once underestimated so completely, now stood as towering giants in his life. And now, after everything that had transpired, he had a decision to make, a decision that could very well shape the course of his future. As the weight of the moment settled upon him, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about proving something to himself. He stood in the dimly lit room, the photographs of success staring back at him, the weight of the owner's words lingering in the air. He had thought he knew the world he operated in, the rules of engagement. He was confident, slick with his words, and quick to brush off anything that challenged him. But tonight had shattered that arrogance, leaving him raw, exposed, and uncertain. Yet at the same time, it had given him a sense of clarity he never had before. You have a chance, the owner repeated, his voice steady but resolute. But it's up to you whether you take it. You've already seen the damage one careless moment can do. Now, can you show me that you've learned something from it? The waiter's mind was a whirl of conflicting thoughts. The pull of his old habits, the ease of slipping back into a persona of indifference, tempted him, but something within him resisted. He had always gotten by on charm, on clever words and quick thinking. But now, those things felt hollow, empty. He had underestimated the couple's power, and worse, he had disrespected the very fabric of what they had worked for, built from the ground up. I don't want to be the kind of person I was, he said finally, the words coming out with a newfound sincerity that surprised even him. The anger and frustration had faded, replaced by something deeper, more introspective. I realized that now. What I said, it was wrong. Not just in the way it hurt her, but in the way it disrespected everything you've worked for. I don't want to be that guy anymore. The owner nodded, his eyes piercing as if assessing the waiter's very soul. Good, he said, his voice softer but no less intense. You're starting to understand. But understanding is just the beginning. Action speaks louder than words. A wave of relief washed over the waiter. He had spoken honestly, and for the first time, he felt like he had taken responsibility for his actions. But there was still so much left unsaid, so much left to figure out. Could he really change? Could he rebuild the bridges he had burned so carelessly? The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Then the owner reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to the waiter, who took it with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. "Open it," the owner said simply. The waiter hesitated for only a moment before tearing open the envelope. Inside, there was a single piece of paper with a set of instructions, a series of tasks that would take him outside his comfort zone, tasks that would test his character in ways he hadn't imagined. Each task was a challenge, a test not just of his work ethic, but of his ability to show real respect, to build from the ground up, just as the owner had done all those years ago. "You'll start tomorrow," the owner said, his tone final. "This is your chance. You prove that you can do this, and we'll talk about your future here. Fail, and you'll never step foot inside this restaurant again." The waiter glanced at the paper once more, a mix of dread and determination rising within him. He had seen challenges before, but this felt different. This was about more than just meeting the expectations of his job. It was about proving something to himself. "I won't fail," he said, his voice steady. The owner gave him a slight nod. "I believe you. But remember, this isn't just about you. This is about every single person who has worked to build something. It's about respect, hard work, and the acknowledgement that we're all connected. The choices you make reflect who you are, and who we are, as a community." With that, the owner turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing through the room. The waiter remained where he was, holding the envelope, the weight of his words and actions sinking in deeper with each passing second. As the door closed behind the owner, the waiter exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He knew this was only the beginning. The real work was about to start, and it would require everything he had. But for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Over the next few weeks, the waiter worked harder than he ever had in his life. The tasks outlined in the envelope pushed him to his limits, forcing him to face his flaws head-on and confront the ways he had once treated people. There were moments of doubt, times when he questioned whether he could change, but with every step forward, the weight on his shoulders lightened just a little. The first task was simple but humbling. Work with the kitchen staff, learning the ropes of food prep, something he had never truly appreciated before. He spent hours cleaning, chopping, and organizing, all while listening to the chefs explain the intricacies of their craft. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real work. It required patience, attention to detail, and respect for the people who made it all happen. At first, the other staff members were skeptical. They had seen him as the charming waiter who never seemed to care, the one who coasted by on his looks and smooth talk. But as the days passed, they began to notice a change. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was learning, genuinely trying to understand what went into running the restaurant, from the kitchen to the front of the house. And more than that, he was showing respect, something he had rarely shown before. One day, the head chef pulled him aside. "You're doing good work," he said, a rare compliment in the kitchen. "Keep it up. You've got potential, but you need to keep this humility if you want to make it." The waiter nodded, grateful for the validation. But he knew he still had a long way to go. The next task took him out into the community. He spent a day volunteering at a local shelter, helping to serve food and clean up after a large event. It was eye-opening. The people there, The ones he had once looked down on without even realizing it were some of the hardest working individuals he had ever met. They didn't care about appearances or status. They were focused on making the best of what they had, no matter how little. By the end of the day, the waiter felt a profound sense of humility. It wasn't just the hard work that had affected him, but the kindness, the willingness to help one another without question or expectation. The stark contrast of his previous attitude couldn't have been more apparent. And through it all, the wife watched. From the shadows, she observed his every move, her quiet eyes tracking his progress, always assessing. The waiter no longer feared her presence, no longer saw her as a figure to be avoided. Instead, he began to respect her in ways he never had before. She wasn't just the wife of a wealthy businessman. She was a woman of strength, conviction, and wisdom. At the end of the month, the waiter found himself back in the office with the owner. There were no harsh words this time, no threats. Instead, the owner simply nodded as he placed a new envelope in front of him. "You've done well," the owner said, his voice approving. "This is the next step." The waiter opened the envelope and looked inside. It wasn't a list of tasks this time. It was an offer. A permanent position at the restaurant, a chance to continue learning and growing, a chance to be part of something bigger than himself. "You've earned it," the owner said, his eyes meeting the waiter's. "But remember, this is just the beginning. There's still work to be done. The real test comes now. How will you continue to grow?" The waiter stood there, the weight of the offer sinking in. For the first time, he felt like he truly understood what it meant to earn his place, not just at the restaurant, but in life. As he left the office that day, the waiter walked with a sense of purpose he had never known before. He wasn't the same man who had walked in weeks ago. He was someone new, someone who had learned that respect, humility, and hard work were the keys to everything. And as he passed the owner's wife, she gave him a small, approving nod. He smiled back, knowing that, despite everything, he had finally found his way.